Hey, this is John Glennon of the Tennessean. I'm here with colleague Jim Wyatt, and we're taking a look at what's happened in the last 24 hours. Titans, of course, have fired Coach Mike Munchak. Ruston Webster is now already in the process of looking for a new head coach. And to kind of take us through the process of what's gone on the last day or even this past week that led to Mike Munchak's firing today, here's Jim Wyatt.
Yeah, and it has been an interesting 24 hours. And to be honest, I'm kind of reluctant to use the word firing because I think it ended up being just a mutual parting of ways because Mike Munchak was put in a position where he, pretty much knew it was a no-win situation for him. He didn't want to take on a challenge of trying to field a team in the last year of his contract where he was going to have to pretty much do away with, half dozen coaches on his coaching staff. And that's ultimately what it came down to. Mike Munchak and Ruston Webster went to Houston on Friday after talking throughout the week. They met with Tommy Smith. During that conversation, Tommy Smith told Mike Munchak, offered him a job for 2014. Said he was going to honor the last year of his contract, but certainly he was going to have to make some changes. And those changes, as I mentioned, involved a lot of members of his staff, offensive coordinator Dow Loggins, defensive coordinator Jerry Gray, Chet Parlavecchio, his good friend who's a linebackers coach, Bruce Matthews, his offensive line coach. Those are just four. And I understand there are at least a half dozen that the Titans were going to have to change in order for Mike Munchak to come back. He'd have a hard time. He'd have a hard time filling those spots in the last year of his contract. I think he knew that, and ultimately he decided today, he just wasn't up for it. So Titans are looking for a new coach. We just talked to Ruston Webster, the general manager. Are the Titans better because of this move? I get the sense that fans are happy about it, to be honest with you, but I guess it remains to be seen.
I think that's right. I think you could make a pretty good case either way for Mike Munchak, but I think honestly that the case for moving on was probably a little stronger if you looked at the numbers. A lot of these numbers have been out there before. This is not news. Mike Munchak was 6-12 against the AFC South over the past 3 years. His record against winning teams that finished with winning records over the last 3 years, 3-20. The last 2 years, 6-10 and 7-9. And in 2 of the last 3 years, they lost to a winless team in the second half of the season. So even though I think the Titans are clearly a better team this year than they were last, better offensively, definitely better defensively, and I do think they were moving in the right direction. It's just that I don't know if those steps were being made quick enough. And you could also argue that he's had 3 years. Should those steps have already been made now instead of him having to make the argument we're moving in the right direction? But in any event, the Titans are moving on from Mike Munchak, immediately looking for new head coaching candidates. And I know, Jim, you mentioned a couple of coaching candidates you'd heard on Twitter earlier today. Why don't you talk about them?
Yeah, a couple of guys I've already been told to keep an eye on just because they've got ties with Ruston Webster, and I think they're certainly on his short list. One of them is Dan Quinn, the defensive coordinator for the Seahawks that Ruston Webster spent some time with in Seattle. Another one is Rich Bisaccia, who is special teams coach for the Cowboys, who interviewed for the Redskins head coaching job just the other day. Those are a couple of guys. I think there'll be more. I mean, you're going to hear James Franklin's name because he's already getting a lot of attention, with NFL teams being interested. You're going to hear, some crazy names like John, people are going to be pushing for John Gruden and Bill Cowher. I think those are unrealistic. But, there's some other good candidates out there that certainly they can look at.
Yeah, there certainly are, and Ruston Webster mentioned today that likely, you'll probably see some of the assistant coaches and the coordinator for some of the current playoff teams be at least on his list of guys he'd like to talk to, and just tossing out some of the names that kind of make sense at this point in terms first of playoff coaches. You look at Seattle, for instance. You've got Darrell Bevel, the offensive coordinator up there, who's worked with Russell Wilson, done good things with Russell Wilson in his first 2 years in the league. The defensive coordinator, who you mentioned, of course, Dan Quinn, Seattle, is of course another person of interest there. Some of the other guys, you actually look at both Cincinnati coordinators. Jay Gruden, we talked about John Gruden is not very realistic, but I think Jay Gruden has done great work with Andy Dalton up there. He's been a coordinator for a while now. He's probably worth a look. And Mike Zimmer, the defensive coordinator with the Bengals, has had Cincinnati in the top 10, in the last 3 years in the league, I believe, and he's done very good things. A lot of people think he's due for a look as a head coach as well. Some of the other names that come to mind, Greg Roman in San Francisco has worked with Colin Kaepernick over the years. You'd think that maybe one of the characteristics, either of the new head coach or certainly of an offensive coordinator, would be that they have to work well with a young quarterback, whether that's Jake Locke or whether that's somebody else. Somebody's going to have to be able to do some work here with a young quarterback. So that's probably important. Maybe a couple other names to throw out there. Jim Mora, of course, the coach at UCLA. Sounds like he's going to stay at UCLA, but has certainly done good work out there, and he's got ties to Ruston Webster. They both worked together in Seattle in the past. One other name just off the top of my head here, Ken Wisenhunt has head coaching experience, as did Jim Mora, and is kind of thought of as an offensive-minded coach as well. So I could go on with about another half dozen names here, but I'm sure they're going to be they'll start to get trimmed down pretty soon. Ruston Webster is going to get on the trail right away to try and find a new head coach. And any closing comments from you, Jim, on this?
It's going to be it's going to be an interesting process. It's been a couple of years since the Titans have had a coaching search. When Mike Munchak was hired 2011, that was Mike Munchak was the slam dunk that year. Now it's kind of a wide open field, and a lot of pressure is on Ruston Webster to find the right guy for this franchise moving forward. So certainly it's going to be an interesting stretch here for John Glennon. I'm Jim Wyatt. Keep us track of us on Twitter, Wyatt Sports, at Glennon Sports, and at Tennessean.com.